Okay. Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Mordew, and this is The Slider, my Substack podcast come newsletter. I explore all kinds of things here, from poetry to politics, essays, ways of looking at culture that are creative as well as analytical. Today, my guest is the academic Stephen Threadgold. He's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales, Australia. As it so happens, Newcastle is my hometown, so there's a little bit of personal interest there on many levels. Stephen's also the director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre there. And he's an associate editor, I think, still of the Journal of Youth Studies too, but he might correct me on that. But he's nodding, so that's a good start. And essentially, from those titles, you'll probably gather that Stephen's research areas go into youth and class, things like unequal career trajectories, and possible alternatives, not all of them good, and underground and creative scenes associated with how youth kind of try to recreate where they're going and who they are. And obviously that kind of leans then into things like, how they finance themselves, how they make a living, what they choose, what gets imposed on them, problems like gambling. I know Stephen's interested in. I am too. I know that's a very big issue, particularly for working class males, and issues like debt. I actually got to know Stephen through the Addy Road Writers Festival that I'm the artistic director of. About 2 years back, I noticed a book of his had come out, I think actually in 2022, but it came to my attention, and it was simply called Class in Australia. And I'd probably like to start with that because the title alone attracted me, because even though Australia loves its sort of maverick convict underdog kind of reputation, the truth of the matter is that it seems these days the word class itself is a kind of dirty word. We don't want to admit there is a kind of a set of class issues and class constructions in Australia that I believe we're working with in more difficult and complex ways than ever.
Yeah, I think like all good class societies, Mark, that like we they develop their own myths and legends over the time to try and cover up the fact that they are class societies. So the idea that Australia is kind of this egalitarian place, and it through the 1800s and the gold rush, the kind of myth of the working man's paradise, and it was man. Um, it's very much shown to be like you know very much myths and legends really, and as many great historians have shown over the years. So yeah, Australia's certainly a class society, inequalities ramping up, um, both between established classes but also kind of generationally. I think it's important not to overstate the generation thing though, because relatively privileged kids will be inheriting stuff from their parents and whatever, and at certain times, to be able to kind of face many of the cost of living crises that we have. But yeah, overall, while, different than say to the US or different than the UK, our kind of colonial overlords, we do kind of have very much a class society, and we can trace, who takes up the dominant positions fairly straightforwardly through different schools. We can see, the kind of siphoning off of wealth more and more to the upper echelons of society.
Yeah, well, I mean, I got to admit that, coming from a working class background myself, although I'm university educated, and that education alone creates a strange sort of schizophrenia, because you kind of
Mm.
join a sub middle class where your education gives you entree and a kind of lifestyle on the lower levels. So
Yeah.
but your history is where you see yourself, and I still regard myself as a Newcastle boy and a working class lad.
Mm.
So I feel loyalty there, but and these days, if I guess if I'm really honest, I feel kind of anger because it seems more and more, certainly in Australia, we've got a kind of in very simple, brute terms, two classes, a propertied class and an unpropertied class. And there's some almost feudal thing happening, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm simplifying too much.
No, 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 not at all. I think the development of that has become very important. Some Australian-based sociologists, Lisa Aikens and Linda Cooper and Martin Konings, have written a very influential book called The Asset Economy, where they trace how our class systems have changed to where one's profession or the job that you do was largely the key, I suppose, identifier of class, both economically and culturally, to increasingly showing how the ownership of property in particular has become very decisive. So, um, within a kind of a position in society, just say professionals, whether they're kind of engineers or doctors or lawyers or whatever. If you're the children of those people, in the past, you're relatively privileged. But these days, if those, lawyers or doctors or whatever haven't bought houses, and let's face it, most of them have, but like if you haven't, you're going to fundamentally face a whole lot of inequalities and problems, being able to financially be secure yourself in the future, despite having that relatively privileged background. Increasingly, we can see things like the property market, where in Sydney and Melbourne, houses appreciate per year more than the average wage.
Mm.
So just ownership, more than the yearly average wage. So ownership of housing and property in general, and multiple houses increasingly, is a key way of thinking about this kind of thing, and how particularly that's going to pan out into the future.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say in relation to that idea of a future, I get this terrible sense that it's not just an economic thing, it's a existential thing in the sense that
Mm.
there's a feeling people are literally losing their dreams, their future,
Yeah,
because of that economic pressure and the ability to imagine something beyond the struggle of the present, that they're consumed by the struggle and they know it. They know it. And that
yeah. The
I
young
find
people we
really
talk to,
troubling. Huh?
many of the young people we talk to are feeling that. They basically express to us in interviews about a bunch of different topics. We're doing a lot of things at the moment about financial practices and the use of fintech, but in previous things we've done about, labor market transitions and school to work transitions, and even kind of creative scenes. That many of the promises they've been made since they were a kid, that, if you work hard enough and you make the right choices and you have particular talents or whatever, this idea of a meritocracy, that things will work out for you. But like, we're talking to uni students over the past few years that are kind of saying that that feels like bullshit now. That, they're paying more than ever for their university degrees, tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, moving towards a housing market that they see is almost impossible to get into until their kind of parents pass on and maybe pass down the house that, then that they split up with their siblings or whatever. So we are seeing this in much of our work. Now, relatively privileged kids still kind of moving along fine, but an increasing um, section of the population moving up the class cohort, well into the middle classes, are feeling this economic precarity and feeling like much of the promises and things that were told to make the right decisions, make the right choices, don't really pay off as much anymore.
Mm.
This this parlays into kind of different attitudes towards the futures, but very much like kind of attitude towards like the here and now. It's like almost this kind of like, how do I structure my life? I can make these decisions to kind of, I want to be this kind of professional in the future, but like even now I can see that like I'm not going to earn enough money to be able to save up at like $150,000 deposit in the next 15 years or whatever.
Mm.
So people tend to be often living more in the here and now. You see a lot of moral panics about this, of how young people are apparently selfish or whatever. But
Mm.
really, these are kind of reasonable reactions to the economic circumstances. So again, relatively privileged people are doing okay, but increasingly up the class scale, experiences of cost of living crises, um, unable to access affordable housing. There's an increasing amount of people, for instance, that are stuck in the rental market, paying more than 30% of their salary as rent, and
Mm.
that's kind of unsustainable, in terms of being able to kind of live sustainably. So
Mm.
we have a real crunch at the moment in terms of what's happening here, and housing in particular is key.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't help but wonder. I mean, your interests, academic, political. but just the nature of I, I sense something troubling and depressing out there, and how um, one sees what's happening, but how
Mm.
does one stop it from being an analysis of and a perpetuation of misery? Like I don't know if you've got
Yeah.
an answer to that at all, but I'm feeling this sense of things going down, and how, particularly for young people,
Mm.
how do they
Yeah.
fight back? You know.
I think there's an interesting combination of things that are important here. I think people as ourselves moving into middle age,
Yep.
I turned 50 last year and I'm a kind of young Gen Xer, I suppose.
Mhm.
But we tend to reflect on the past through rose-colored glasses, and so there's always been these issues. But there's no doubt just in the raw, figures, in terms of what people face that it's being financially secure is increasingly difficult. So what we find in our research with young people across, again, a number of different projects. I did a project nearly 10 years ago now, with young people up and down the east coast of Australia that were in kind of creative scenes,
Mhm.
particularly punk and DIY kind of cultures, and people in bands, people with their own little record labels, people making art, people running venues, and they were, in some respects reflecting a fairly traditional bohemian lifestyle and kind of, have leftist politics. But much of the support systems for that over the decades had been eroded. It's much harder to get the dole, it's much harder to get support for artistic practices. But also at the same time, many of these young people were doing all the things. They were getting a career. They'd done the university degree. They were working in various sectors that they thought were ethical, but were finding that um, not being very satisfying. So there was this interesting thing that I found that like people with these kind of orientations towards the world, very much kind of punk orientations toward the world, were often doing things like look kind of like a sea change that people have in their 50s and 60s once they're kind of set up financially. And that old thing in the 90s where people would move to the country town and live a comfortable life. People in urban centres in particular were deciding to give up careers and basically go back to saying working 2 days a week to support themselves and maybe investing themselves more in their creative practices. And the reasons for this, they would tell me, is that it seemed impossible to get ahead in those careers anyway. And, you had to work 60 hours a week, and that's not what life's about. And even the money you're earning is not enough to buy a place in where I want to live in, artistic suburbs or creative suburbs. So they were making a choice, sometimes in their mid to late 20s, to be poor and saying that out loud. I'm probably going to be poor for the rest of my life,
Mhm.
but I'm going to live with people that I want to live with. I'm going to do the creative practices I want to do. And they were seeing this as an ethical choice to make at the time. Now, what I'd really like to do is go and find those people 10 years on to see if they're still playing that out. Because in some ways, you could argue there's a bit of kind of optimistic naivety to, choosing to be poor in the future and be able to live like that. But, many people throughout generations have lived like this and been able to find ways to support themselves and not necessarily join what they were referring to themselves as the rat race and getting into these kind of seemingly endlessly treadmill situations where it's work, 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 debt, debt, debt.
Mhm.
Um, Very difficult to kind of pay off and get ahead.
Well, I mean that kind of leads me to ask you a more personal question, because I know at one point you wanted to be a rock journalist yourself, and you moved into
Yeah,
sociology and academic studies, and I can actually see the connection, because I
for
studied
sure.
sociology at Newcastle Uni and kind of moved in the opposite direction and became a rock journalist. But I always felt sociology as well as English were really
Mhm.
a very kind of helpful combination to me. But I guess
Yep.
it makes me wonder why you do this uh, kind of study yourself. Like what's your
Yeah,
loyalty to it? Because I'm sensing that you feel there's a kind of vocational thing going on with it for you.
definitely, definitely. So there's lots of things to say about that. Firstly, working in universities is increasingly fraught, and they're precarious places with a lot of high psychological harm going on in them. So a few weeks ago, there's a study come out, and University of Newcastle was ranked one of the worst in the country at that. But I would also say that like it is a good job for a number of reasons. and maybe get a chance to go into that in a sec. But going backwards, yeah, my trajectory into sociology. I left school in 1992. I got an electrical apprenticeship in the power stations down the Central Coast. Um, I can't really remember making a decision to do that. It's just kind of what everyone did.
Mm.
But I had absolutely no interest in that kind of manual labor, and I didn't really know what I was doing. Except at the time I was playing lots of sport. I was good at cricket and played a fair bit of tennis, and um, so I finished my apprenticeship in '96, and they put all 27 of us off. That's the kind of time right when the state government stopped doing all the kind of apprenticeship training, and lo and behold, a few years later, there was a huge tradie shortage in the late '90s. I don't know if you remember that, because
Yeah,
when
right now.
people like that, like me, went off and did other things. I kind of bummed around playing cricket for a few years in between Australia and England. And then it was like 1998, 99. I was like 24 and I had like $12 in the bank. And I was like, okay, I probably need to find out what I want to do here. And I went to the university and saw what my options were. And I had an admin officer kind of person give me some great advice that you could come in and do arts, and you said you kind of want to get into journalism. I thought I was really interested in music, but I was also thought maybe my sporting career could kind of move me into kind of sports journalism. This kind of just definitely wanted to get into kind of some kind of cultural journalism. So I did arts with the idea that I'd change over to communications to do journalism, but and I did that for a semester, but yeah, I just
Mm.
discovered sociology a little bit late in the degree. I did a political science major, but then, basically had a lecturer that really took me under their wing, Pam Nyland, who's like sliding doors moment, really said that I want you to do honours with me. And then I did honours, and I got good marks, got the university medal. And she said, I really'd like you to do a PhD. I think I can get you a scholarship. And at the time I was like, why would I want to do this? Like, I don't see any future. But then I was also like, maybe I can get $350 a week here to study and, like, bum around and play cricket and go to gigs. And it seems like a pretty good lifestyle to be a student and doing this thing at the same time. And yeah, it wasn't until I really started the PhD and understood that I could make maybe a career out of it that I really dedicated myself to it. I was kind of bumming around a little bit first in
Hmm.
it, to be honest. But once I started doing the research in particular and did a PhD on young people's attitudes towards the future through a class lens, yeah, I really discovered a passion there because it related back to my own experiences of going to Mount View High and seeing all these young guys getting into the mines and all this kind of stuff. And again, it just seemed like a normal thing to do without thinking too much about why.
Mm.
And kind of sociology kind of gave me the tools to kind of think a little bit about why those things were happening, and like to think a little bit about why we were all, fucking around in class and not doing any work and like, insulting the teacher or whatever. There's all kinds of amazing sociology studies that gave explanations for that. And I just really got into it and yeah, basically been there ever since.
Mm. I might just get you to move across slightly. The cameras, you're
Oh,
over to
sorry.
one
Yeah.
side a bit. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah, it's starting to disappear off the screen on me. Oh, that's really interesting to hear because I feel like my 20s were very similar with regard to rock journalism. And I mean, well, obviously, in past decades, there goes one of the inner west planes overhead, one of the large birds that frequent the area.
Yeah.
I don't know. It actually is relevant to our conversation about class and youth because and I'm trying not to be nostalgic about, but they're just combined with online digital life, there just seem more time to create yourself and to possibly invent a direction or future, and everything seems so much more accelerated now. And
Mm.
one thing, and I don't know, it's something that you can explain in simple terms, but I saw that you're exploring this thing called data gaze, where the corporations and I think social media, like how they're accruing information on people, particularly young people, and it's like a mirror that's coming back, and they're profiting off literally directing and formatting identities for people, and what they can be and where they can go, and kind of
Yes.
constricting who we are. And young people, because they are literally formative beings, are particularly vulnerable to this type of data gaze from the mega corporations. Is that a correct way to frame it?
Yeah, mostly I think so. The kind of move towards how much of our life is it's digitalized and lived out online has created these huge, billion, if not probably getting to the point of trillion-dollar industries now. So you consider the way that the AI industry has ramped up over the past couple of years. And so there's a lot of sociology on this, the idea of data lives, data selves, data doppelgangers, in terms of um, companies essentially can track more and more of aspects of our lives, learn more and more about us. They put us in all kinds of different categories, and they do this for numerous reasons, whether it's to sell us advertising. But increasingly, that data is used in ways that are kind of beyond advertising. I'm not sure I would care so much if it was just if, like, Facebook's trying to get me to buy a particular record or a new tent or whatever. Like, advertising something to deal with on one level, and it can be a pain in the ass, but it's also funny to deal with sometimes how bad it is, right?
Mm.
Or you bought
Yeah.
something, it's still trying to sell you that product for the next year.
Yeah, yeah. You buy a
What's,
hammer
what's,
from
what's,
Bunnings, and for the next 2 weeks, every time you drive near it, you're getting offered more hammers and nails.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But what's much more pernicious now is the mission creep of what's happened with data. So all the platforms that we use, and it doesn't matter what you are, like we're on Zoom now, it's going to sell our data in some way. It's probably taking a transcript. I don't know what it's doing. Um, and it's all the data's kind of packaged up, sold and bought and auctioned off to different data cartels and then used for different kind of purposes. So increasingly data is used to kind of make these categorizations, and it'll be used to decide who gets access to a rental, who gets access to health insurance, who gets a mortgage, all these kind of different things. We know, for instance, that Spotify in particular, if we're kind of talking about music culture here, has got all kinds of partnerships with different companies, and they're selling them. Spotify essentially is not a music company, it's a data company, and it claims that it can sell these other companies your mood. Spotify claims it knows what mood you're in by the music you're listening
Wow.
to,
Okay. Well, that's
and
probably quite
therefore you can
true.
be kind of marketed to. Well, I know I find that proposition ridiculous. I mean, I don't listen to Elliott Smith when I'm sad.
Yeah.
Sometimes I listen to Elliott Smith when I'm really happy, right?
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
like the correlations they'll be making there, I think, and it doesn't matter if they're bullshit. It's just if people are buying the bullshit. This is what the industries are. So, for me, the more worry here is like, yeah, everything you do online and everything you're kind of walking around your phone, and everything's being tracked. So the kind of but when I say that to people, people think I've watched too many episodes of Black Mirror or whatever, but this is just happening, right?
Mm.
And it's just taken for granted, and you've give everyone permission to do it every time you've clicked on the terms and conditions with the 75 pages that none of us read. So it's just this is constantly happening. There's a huge industry. We're all being bought and sold every second. Um, so when you kind of feel like your phone's listening to you, of course you've had a conversation, and then all of a sudden you get an ad for something or whatever. I'm not saying your phone's not listening to you. On Facebook Messenger, for instance, you've probably ticked that they can turn on the microphone every now and then just by having that on your phone. But what's actually happening is a bunch of auctions going on in the background for you based on all the things you've been doing in the past years, months, days, hours, and seconds. And often when you get that thing that really haunts you, that feels like it's listening to you, it's just a very successful auction where it's sent you the thing that you've just been talking about a minute ago. So these machines are constantly doing that kind of stuff. Reckoning with it is really hard. Um, we're often here like telling young people to like just stop using these things. It's like telling them to stop breathing. It's like these things are a life now. So the idea that telling young people, for instance, to get off social media or stop using Spotify or whatever, it's like telling them to stop watching television in the 70s. Um, Media is always used as much as possible by the generations that kind of are born into it. So regulation in particular is a real thing here. The research we're doing at the moment on fintech, for instance, and I just went to a conference last week about gambling. It's just incredible what's going on in that industry and the way they're targeting vulnerable people. We know that they target problem gamblers, but nothing's being done about this. There's some lip service to it, but like we have a prime minister that I think, is your member of parliament in Marrickville there that like essentially just parrots Peter Vlandie's talking points about the gambling industry, made promises about regulating the ads, but has done nothing since, and if anything is now boosting it more than ever. So we have a real problem of the morals around this and the ethics about our leaders actually doing something about it. They seem to be addicted to the lobbying. They seem to be addicted to the taxes, but they're not taxed enough, frankly. And in terms of the social damage that they do, these things, in terms of the public cost, way outweighs what they actually gain from them.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite a dark analysis in many ways. And I mean, I just instinctively feel troubled by these kind of energies, you know, as a big social media user and promoter of my work through social media, and all the paradoxes of that, like fearful of what I see happening to potentially my kids,
Yeah,
who are in their late teens and early 20s. And
yeah,
even the energies with myself in terms of political debate and the angertainment principles and
mm,
the feeling of a sort of spiraling in your positions or ways of thinking. So it's more than just polarization. It's you have an opinion, and there's almost as if you're being farmed, and that
yeah,
opinion and the negative reactions as well as the positive sort of escalate it, and you begin to feel the potential for yourself to become more extreme than
yeah. The
initially
politics of
felt.
algorithms here is just really important. Yeah.
Beg your pardon?
Yeah, the algorithmic politics is really important. The black box, the algorithmic politics that happens here is really important. We know the big social media companies promote uh, more and more confrontation, more and more extreme views, because that's what gets clicks and what keeps people on there. And so this is a very real problem. Um, I, 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 I've kind of questioned their social license to exist. I must say, in many realms, in terms of in some of the damage they're doing. But in saying that as well, we all seem to be reflexively complicit in this. I mean, I'm on Facebook. I can't bring myself to give up Spotify, even though I think I should,
Hmm.
because of the ease. The ease of it is just like it's so easy. Like, and I don't want to pay a $20 a month subsidy to some tech bro that's now subsidizing war drones, right? No, investing in war drones. I
Hmm.
don't want to do that, but like it's become so central to how I kind of consume things. So, yeah, there's a real problem here that they've managed to kind of make ease and access um, part of the kind of Faustian bargain that we kind of, all of us kind of have when we kind of use these things. Again, we've done some really interesting workshops with young people over the past year about specific platforms. We're just interested in the way they use different platforms and their ethics and their opinions of them. And so we did them on Spotify, ChatGPT. We did some kind of um, location apps, and I think we did a couple on Afterpay. Um, and there's a commonality that comes out in them that most young people are very wary of these things. They don't just kind of blindly use these things and they're just kind of cultural dupes with them, but they engage with them in, a different array of ways, often critical, often just kind of using them how they're meant to be used. In those workshops, we often presented things to them about the platforms that they didn't know about. For instance, I put up, Daniel Ek, CEO of Spotify, just spent 600 million euros of his own money to kind of fund these kind of war drones. And like most of them didn't know about that. Some of them are like, that's terrible. I'm going to rethink whether I use it or not. Some of them are like, whatever. Like, all these kind of rich people are evil anyway. It's just another one. And
Mm.
others were like, we had just one person go, right, that's it. I'm getting rid of Spotify. I've been kind of trying to find my reason to do it. And
Mm.
this is it. I'm going to delete it now.
Mm.
And so there's a politics of engagement with these things that many young people are actually really reflexively thinking about in their day-to-day lives.
Mm.
But like, all these companies are kind of the air we breathe, right? They're like
Yeah.
how life is lived. And
Mm.
so just kind of opting out of them, there's kind of real FOMO thing, right? You can't just kind of not be on social media. Like, I mean, I went through a while there where I kind of stopped finding out about gigs because I was finding about gigs through Facebook events, and now they don't do that anymore. And there was a year there where I was like, why don't I find out these events anymore? And they're all shifted to these other platforms, and I had to go and chase them, right? That's what old people have to do. But like young people are just kind of born into this stuff as a fish in water.
Mm.
And it's kind of, I think we have to be kind of careful in kind of thinking about how they can just stop using them because they're how life is lived today. So um, there's no easy answers to it, but I think certainly governments need to be much better at regulation. I'm not convinced banning's a good idea either. I've been kind of against the under 16s ban, particularly because what also happens on social media is many young people find their people on there. You know, if you're a kid getting bullied at school, just like old subcultures or whatever, you can find people that are more like you and kind of you can identify with and maybe, have friends and stuff like that. So there's not all negatives here. There's like any kind of technology, there's kind of pros and cons and risks and affordances. So finding the balance, I think, is the trick. But at the moment, we're just so dominated by these companies that they just seem all powerful.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really tough one to negotiate. I guess my
Mm,
fears are, uh, to some extent, go beyond the political and the sociological, and they go into some really uneasy sense that we're literally being changed. Our consciousness is being shifted
mm,
and reduced to, I feel as if the categorical nature of social media and digital life is shrinking our spirit,
mm.
and I don't know the answer to that. I'd have you to not to be, but it
Well, I've got
concerns me.
a few things about that. I mean, I think what happens with social media is it brings out aspects of our personalities and character anyway. So there's aspects of that. I think, yeah, I think there's been interesting studies done with ChatGPT, for instance, and students' use of that in the US. There was a kind of experimental thing. I'm not sure it's been peer reviewed yet, but authors talk. I had three groups of students. One where students did all the assignments in a class and over a year. One where they did some of it and got AI to do some of it, and one where one group used AI to do everything. They tested their cognitive abilities at the start and then tested them at the end. And the group that used ChatGPT over the year and didn't do anything themselves had less cognitive development than the other groups at the end of the time.
Mm,
So, like, that's probably an extreme example, but it's like in terms of replacing learning and
mm,
letting a machine doing it yourself, you can probably make some arguments about how that's kind of maybe changing how humans function or whether some humans, become smarter or dumber or whatever. But I think, again, like I think the vast majority of people engage with these things relatively kind of critically. I
mm.
mean, I do find myself doom scrolling sometimes, and after like 10 minutes, I'm like, oh, I got to stop, and you go and do something else, right?
Me too. Me
So
too.
that they don't control us.
Mm,
Um, and I think the story of how they control us actually gives these companies too much power in terms of what they have in our lives. We actually control our use of this kind of stuff, and I think the discourse around how they control us actually kind of gives up in a way
mhm,
the power to them.
mhm.
And I'm not convinced most people are engaging with them to that kind of depth of extent. You can see all kinds of extreme examples of how people, end up going crazy because they're talking to ChatGPT all day or whatever. But like they're anomalies mostly. They're not how most people are kind of using these things.
Actually, hearing you talk just makes me think of the parallel to that sort of digital life and drinking and gambling and smoking, and that some people have the misfortune, either through bad luck or some habitual
Yeah.
thing in them, to become very addicted. I do always think, though, there's something about screens and this
Mm.
trance-like quality to screen life that seems to particularly appeal to males. I'm not sure what that's about, but the physiology of it. I mean, that's again just a sort of instinctive,
Yeah.
vaguely, generalized kind of perspective.
Yeah.
Um, there's,
I'm not,
the
I'm
yeah.
not sure it applies more or less to different genders. I think it just there's different aspects of it that appeal in different ways.
Hmm.
I'll go back to the point you're making before, like to compare it to things, problem risky things, whether that's, gambling or drinking or, driving cars too fast or whatever, young people might do at that age. I think that's a kind of better way to think about it. The research we've done, for instance, on gambling, like with young men, very small pilot study, showed that most of them weren't getting into trouble and they weren't losing lots of money. They were kind of treating it as a leisure practice, with their mates. and kind of in a way budgeting. So these were relatively, not rich kids, but like, kids with, 25-year-olds with kind of good jobs. What's concerning from me, from a more sociological person that's interested in culture, is the way that the gambling industries have managed to make themselves part of these cultures. Like they're ubiquitous in sport now. Like gambling now seems to be sport. And so also what they seem to be, one of the things we write about in our stuff on fintech is the way these things are kind of financializing more and more aspects of our lives. And so, the bet with mates part of the gambling app seems to be like, financializing friendship. It's a way for people to kind of be friends, but they're spending money, and it's a way to kind of get a cut out of our bank accounts more and more. So the kind of cultural kind of normalization aspects to me, the way that kind of gambling is almost ambient across culture now is, I think, more of a problem as sorry, much of a problem as the kind of thinking of the risk and the problem gamblers. Now, problem gambling is a huge problem,
Mhm.
um, but the way that kind of gambling has just become this ubiquitous practice, I think, is as interesting. Um, but the conference I went to last week, there was lots of reasoning about this, about boredom, about like some people gambling as a form of optimism in a way, in terms of some of those cost of living things we were talking about earlier on. Um, but yeah, particularly pernicious is the kind of the various affiliative marketing stuff, the way that like various games are directed at kids to kind of train them to kind of get into a gambling mindset. Things like tipping comps and stuff like that around sport, all sponsored by gambling, and ways of kind of getting people to have accounts and all that kind of stuff. Again,
Okay.
to me, that's the stuff where attention needs to be paid. When you're a 25-year-old or 50-year-old or whatever, I think you have enough autonomy and experience to be able to make decisions about this stuff in a way that's probably not so much for a 12-year-old that's watching the footy and getting the odds rammed down their throats.
Okay, well, we're beginning to run out of time here, and
Yeah,
I guess, I mean, there's been a not theoretical, but I was just interested in the on the ground things that you're getting from these conversations you're having with, teenagers and young people in Newcastle itself.
yep,
What the city feels like at the moment to you, like honestly, just in your engagements, what
yeah.
you sense going on, because it's still. Like it's still a town with problems, and yet it has its beaches and the valley. It's always been a funny town that way. So beautiful, and yet so heavy with class issues too.
It is, yeah. I think so. I think, you know, like across Australia, but in like, big regional towns like Australia is starting to mimic the cost of living stuff that's going on in cities. Like the rental market in Newcastle's out of control. It's very hard to find a place to live.
Hmm.
Um, so I think, all that kind of negative stuff is spoken about is happening. But like, Newcastle's a wonderful town. I love living here. It's like, if anything, I think we're increasingly worried that more people from the metropolitan areas are moving here, and we're going to end up with like some of those metropolitan
Yeah,
issues.
yeah, I want to
There's a
come
lot of
home, but I
development
can't
going
afford
on.
it.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of development going on that again has the usual tensions about how much we would like the inner city to retain its kind of, heritage kind of profile and aesthetic, to oppose to also the need for more housing and where there's jobs and all that kind of stuff. So that stuff's a constant, and it's going on episodically, throughout the city. But I think Newcastle's got a pretty thriving arts scene, and there's just a huge amount of great young bands in this country, in this city at the moment. I mean, we have an event on the October long weekend called West Best Block Fest.
Oh yeah, I know
That
that. I went all the time. Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah, one block in the city, about 8 or 10 venues from midday to midnight. Basically, just has bands on all day. 110 bands from Newcastle playing original music, and you can walk around there all day and go and see a funk band, a pop band, a punk band, a metal band, just happening all day. I think, despite the fact of the loss of some venues, there's a bit of a really good underground, and not just underground, like a music scene. I suppose I'm more interested in underground indie kind of stuff, but like
Mm.
there's several pubs in town you can go and see good stuff every night. So I think the city, like always, is thriving in some respects, struggling in others. There's real inequalities. Um, yeah, but I think we've kind of always been a kind of well-kept secret, I think. There was a while there about 10 years ago where Newcastle was voted like in one of the top 10 hipster cities in the world. This was around
Right.
when I was writing about hipsters and bogans and through a class lens, which was interesting. We still have a lot of our young people leave, and they tend to often skip Sydney and move to Melbourne, I think is a fairly common trajectory. Um, because it's relatively limited opportunities here as well.
Mm.
But yeah, I think the cities overall seems to be doing pretty well.
Well, that's good to hear, and I sense it within my own writing, whatever form it takes, journalism or poetry, that there's that tension between wanting to be truthful and identify darknesses or problems as you see them, and yet being aware that what you do also creates the future.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe this is a good thing to wrap up on, but I was kind of impressed by the ethic underlying your research, particularly with young people, through the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre, that you're trying to somehow democratise it so it's not a one-way study, that you're somehow trying to help them drive the research and not be
yeah.
kind of formed in the way that we're talking, the way social media can farm people, that you're trying to somehow give them some power and volition in the process. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right. Our center's very much based on an ethic of doing research with young people, not on them.
Mm.
It's kind of the quip I use to kind of explain that. I think there's a lot of research that's done on young people. It tends to be from a very governmentalized risk, pathological point of view that we struggle with, in terms of being actually real representation of their lives. So yeah, we tend to try and include young people in the way that we do research. One thing we certainly do at the end of most of our projects now is like have workshops with young people where we present them what we've found and take suggestions from them about what we can do to help make an impact,
Mm.
in terms of education or policy and stuff like that. So we try and include young people in those processes as well because they're largely left out of anything to do with kind of regulating or helping them in their lives. And yet, young people are the experts in their own lives. I know adults think they're experts, but like, by the time you get into your 30s or 40s, you've largely forgot what it's like to be a young person. It just seems to be this ubiquitous thing where you start looking back at young people as today as if they're doing everything wrong and back
Yeah.
in the past things were better and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
Aristotle and Plato were doing that, right? So like, it just seems to be this thing people do. I had a great PhD student, Barney Langford, who was in his 60s when he started, and he worked with young people his whole life, and he hated that point of view, and he interviewed people in their 60s and I think in their 30s or 40s and in their 20s and in their teens. And even the teens were doing it to like 6 year olds. Like, 6 year olds today, they've all got iPads. And when I was a 6 year old, I never had an iPad. So it seems to be something we do. And our center's very much set up in a way to try and represent young people's life and their opinions and their experiences because we think that, yeah, as I said, they're the experts on their lives and they're the ones that need to be able to kind of have input into how their lives should be.
Mm. Okay, great. That's a good way to end. Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate you making time to talk to me. Yeah, cool.
No, thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate the invitation.
No
Cheers.
worries. No worries at all. Uh,